I've got a very, very hard act to follow. Even worse, I'm an archeologist. I don't know why the hell I'm here, but actually, having listened to Richard, I do. Archeology is the science of garbage. Didn't you know we're pith-helmeted professors who dig with crowds of sweating natives in the shadow of ancient pyramids? That's it. That's why I'm here. We really have a very strange public image. On the one hand, Indiana Jones. On the other hand, nerds with little dental picks. And I'm not surprised that some members of this audience have told me they took archaeology in college and got a D in their course. It's not for everybody. My task this afternoon is to convince you that archaeology has something worthwhile to say about climate change. The point is this: we're Homo sapiens sapiens, the wise people, capable of endless ingenuity and opportunism. We plan ahead, we think rationally, and create astonishing works of art. We love and we hate. We fight and we make peace. We negotiate with one another. We fall in love, get married, have children, and die. We live today in a much more complex world than our remote predecessors ever did. But they had the same intellectual and physical potential as ourselves. And as we live our lives, the past is always there, offering precedent, offering fear, offering encouragement. What have we got to learn about how people have adapted to climatic change? The world has passed through at least 9 glacial and warmer periods over the past 750,000 years. For about 75% of that time, global climate has been in transition from warm to cold and back again. Generally, the warming has been rapid, the cooling more gradual. But as Richard pointed out, it's never been regular. It's constant change. There is no such thing as a stable climate. There's no such thing as a normal climate. At the moment, we're in the latest of these warm periods, which typically last for a shorter time than glacial episodes. So, in the fullness of time, our world will once again plunge into another glacial interval. We don't know when or how severe it will be, but it will. Or will it, given human global warming? I've heard people suggest that a renewed cold will settle on Earth about 23,000 years from now. But this is merely a rough guesstimate and does not take into account our own effect on the climate. We can only be certain of one thing. Despite predictions of massive global warming caused by human activity, the natural cycles of warm and cold will continue. The issue is to what extent human action will affect the natural cycle of things. For 750,000 years, humans have successfully lived through and adapted to major long and short-term climatic change. Let's look at some examples from the last 10 or 11,000 years. As you know, during the last cold period, massive ice sheets mantled Scandinavia, the Alps, and much of North America as far south as the Great Lakes. As the Ice Age ended, about 18,000 years ago or a little later, these ice sheets retreated rapidly in North America, and they formed at the southern limits of this ice sheet a huge glacial lake, very appropriately named Lake Agassiz, after the famous glaciologist who discovered the Ice Age in the 19th century. And then, about 13,000 years ago, this glacial lake broke through a lobe of glacial moraine, and billions of liters of ice-cold fresh water cascaded into the North Atlantic. This flowed over the ocean and slowed the natural circulation of the Gulf Stream. Within a few generations, perhaps within even shorter time, Europe and much of North America was plunged again into near glacial conditions that lasted for nearly 1,000 years. Now, at the time, Europe was populated by a sparse population of nomadic hunter-gatherers who adapted effortlessly to the new conditions. Why? Because they could move around. They adapted effortlessly. But in another part of the world, severe drought settled over the land. This was Southeast Asia. At the end of the Ice Age, there was a big band of very lush oak pistachio forest, which was so lush with fall nut harvests that people could live in this place permanently, living by hunting and particularly gathering plant foods, and live in permanent settlements in one place. One of these places, and this is a picture taken in the 1970s, so it's rather old, they lived on a settlement called Abu Huraira. It's now buried under a dam across the Euphrates River. And they lived with oak forests close to the village. Then the Younger Dryas came. Drought settled over the land, severe drought. The oak forests retreated from Abu Huraira. The people in desperation, and we know these from large samples of seeds which have been studied by a botanist called Gordon Hillman, they turned to wild grasses. But then the wild grasses came in short supply, so they turned to famine foods, less favored plants. And then suddenly, about 12,500 years ago, the people took the next logical step. They started to plant wild grasses on purpose to expand the range of the wild grass. Now, one of the big lessons you learn about history is that very often people do things in good faith, thinking it's a sound strategy, but in 100 or 1,000 years, the consequences are unimaginable. And if there is one, it is that of the beginnings of agriculture. With startling suddenness, within a century, the hunters in Syria, in southeast Turkey, had become farmers full-time. This immediately anchored them to their lands. They settled in permanent villages. They dealt with all sorts of complex social problems, living cheek by jowl with close relatives with whom you quarreled, or you fell in love, or you fought, or you weren't on speaking terms. The whole of human society had to be restructured to deal with this new reality. By the time of Christ, almost everybody on earth lived off agriculture and animal husbandry. Excuse me, a very short period of time if you consider the broad spectrum of human existence. A number of climatologists are beginning to suggest that the present warming trend may result in the implosion, or part of the implosion, of the Greenland ice sheet. This picture is totally irrelevant. I just like the cow. What would happen if a huge flood of fresh water suddenly entered the North Atlantic again and again slowed the Gulf Stream? Under this scenario, my picture isn't as nice as Richard's, but it's not bad. Under this scenario, Europe and much of North America might again be plunged suddenly into extreme cold conditions. Growing seasons would be shortened drastically. There would be profound effects on the productivity and yield of European and North American agriculture. It's no coincidence that the Pentagon has commissioned studies of this scenario and its implications for national security. And it's no coincidence that some European nations are already planning against this possible, perhaps remote, climatic scenario. At issue here is our vulnerability to climatic change. There are many forms of climatic change, as you know. There are the millennial changes, such as the major shifts between cold and warm during the Ice Age. They're part of the long-term backdrop of history. Living day by day, we never really are conscious of these. Then there were century-long drought cycles, or periods of colder, more changeable, or wetter climate, like the hardyable, variable Little Ice Age, immortalized by this picture by Bruegel. These periods do impinge more closely on our consciousness. But it's short-term events, like El Niños and exceptionally cold years, or unusually active hurricane seasons, or volcanic eruptions that are seared in generational memory. We find it hard to realize that our thinking about future climatic change must move beyond these short-term events to longer-term ones that last a century or more. And if you want to think about global warming, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest that you take a flight from Europe to Los Angeles, over Greenland, on a fine summer's day, sit on the right-hand side of the aircraft, and you will see how Greenland is changing. With the new climatology, and Richard has given us a brilliant account of its impact, and the increasing sophistication of computer modeling today, we can for the first time begin to predict the longer-term climatic future. We have to do so, as our civilization is exceptionally vulnerable to phenomena such as major El Niño events or rising sea levels. We can look back into the past and see this vulnerability unfolding. Ancient Egyptian civilization was the longest lived of all ancient civilizations and survived and thrived for more than 3,000 years. Our civilization is but a blink of the eye compared with that. What is not generally known is that it almost collapsed in 2180 BC. Popular stereotypes have it that Egypt always enjoyed bountiful harvests fed by the Nile. In fact, the Nile is a capricious river with highly variable floods from year to year, controlled by rainfall in Central Africa and the distant Ethiopian highlands. A matter of a few meters was the difference between a good flood and a bad one. And Egyptian priests, for good reason, developed nilometers to predict the height of the flood. Between about 3000 and 2200 BC, the pharaohs enjoyed relatively good floods. They created a powerful kingdom, celebrated their immortality with vast pyramids and mortuary temples. After about 2500 BC, the floods lessened somewhat. The pharaoh Pepi II ruled Egypt for a staggering 64 or maybe 94 years, we're not quite sure. He had trouble keeping his powerful provincial governors in line and bribed them with lavish gifts. But his authority was weakened during a reign which was remarkable for somewhat lower floods than usual. He died in 2184 BC. He had ruled by appeasement and weakened the kingdom. And remember, this was a very rigidly controlled, centralized government. And then between 2180 and 2160 BC, catastrophically low droughts brought famine and disaster to Egypt. Political chaos ensued. The pharaohs had always proclaimed, "We are gods, we are infallible, we control the Nile." Their credibility vanished almost overnight. When they produced no grain from their storehouses, Egypt fell apart. The kingdom passed into the control of powerful warlords. All Egypt was dying of hunger, boasted one of these officials named Antifi on his tomb. "I managed that no one died of hunger in this province. The entire country had become like a starved grasshopper, with people going to the north and the south in search of grain." He and his colleagues sealed the borders of their provinces, rationed grain carefully, and managed to survive. But Egypt itself did not become a unified kingdom again for a century. And the pharaohs never forgot this. From being infallible gods, they turned themselves into shepherds of the people. They invested massively in irrigation and in storage facilities. And Egypt survived for another 2,000 years. Why? because the pharaohs realized on the one hand they had to control the population, and on the other they had to have some flexibility. The history of civilization is littered with the remains of collapsed cities and states that once ruled by authoritarian lords. The city of in southern Iraq, excuse me, Eridu and other great cities are now nothing more than desolate ruins, decimated by drought and violent floods that rerouted the Euphrates. The lords of Sipan presided over the Moche civilization of northern coastal Peru. They boasted of staggering wealth in gold and silver, considered themselves living gods, a group, a small elite, very wealthy, controlling an irrigation state with no thought that they were fallible. They gazed out at the world in a serene way from their pots. But a series of major epochal El Niños and earthquakes and a failure of the anchovy fisheries toppled this civilization in short order. Why? Because it was extremely vulnerable to 100-year rains, and there was no mechanism of flexibility in the society whatsoever. It was run for the benefit of a few. The vulnerability of human society was extreme. Contrast this with the ancestral pueblo of Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. People who lived there 1,000 years ago, who built elaborate towns in the midst of a drought-prone landscape. These towns flourished during plentiful rain years during the 10th and 11th centuries. And then, excuse me, a major drought descended over the southwest in 1135 and lasted for 50 years. Now, unlike the pharaohs and the Moche, the Pueblos had a long philosophical history of movement in the face of drought. They were careful to maintain connections through kin and trade with people in villages where there was more water. And between 1130 and 1150, the Chaco Canyon people dispersed from these huge towns to live among fellow kin at the edge of the San Juan Basin, where they remain to this day. This may all seem very esoteric for a Poptech conference, but it's not. We live in an era not of uniformly warming climate, but of constant shifts, twists, and turns, despite long-term warming trends. Look at the record of the last 1,200 years. 1,100 years ago, we were in the midst of a warmer cycle. As Richard told you, the northern ice pack receded. The Norse voyaged to Iceland, Greenland, and then Newfoundland in their canals. And I tell you, if you're in a ship sailing into the teeth of a 45-knot gale across an iceberg-strewn sea off southern Greenland in midsummer, you realize that the Norse were very, very tough people indeed. One is staggered at their achievement and staggered at the casualty rate that must have come as the price of this voyaging. And then the Little Ice Age began, around 1300, bringing the ice southward. Norse voyages to Greenland ended. Their settlements, as Richard told you, were eventually abandoned. Between 1315 and 1321, Europe, still a continent of subsistence farmers, suffered through a 7-year cycle of crop failures brought by cold and rain. And 1.5 million people are estimated to have died from hunger and disease-related epidemics. Because in those days, Europe was a subsistence continent, or in current parlance, a third world continent. The ensuing centuries of increased storminess brought sea surges to, excuse my voice, never get a cold in California, it gets in your throat, brought sea surges to the Low Countries. At least 25,000 people, probably more, died in the Great Drowning of Men, as it was called, in 1362, when a gale and an accompanying high tide swallowed entire villages. The lesson from this is, the denser the population, the larger the cities, the more complex the infrastructure, the greater the vulnerability. Since 1860, as a result of the wider use of fossil fuels and the Industrial Revolution, we've witnessed global warming. More benign climate, you say. Consider this very sobering statistic, which is almost certainly an underestimate. Over 20 million subsistence farmers in the tropics of China, India, and Southeast Asia perished as a result of monsoon failure and major El Niños during the 19th century, many of them in the very vigorous El Niño events of a mere century ago. My grandfather, by a bizarre historical coincidence, was involved in the administration of famine relief in one of these monsoon areas. Think how many more people would have died if today's population densities and urban sprawl had been in place then. Today, over 200 million people live on marginal agricultural and grazing land throughout the world. They're far more vulnerable than their ancestors, and it's a matter of time until a famine of true crisis proportion, far worse than anything of recent years, decimates not thousands, but millions of people and others on better watered land. And I'd say one of the most formative experiences in my life was to spend 7 years in Central Africa living among subsistence farmers. And another formative experience has been to spend over 30 years teaching 300 freshmen a year archeology, and realizing that their total consciousness of cultural diversity is the McDonald's on the corner. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a crime. As somebody said this morning, and by God they were right, how little we know about how other people look at the world and think and put their world together. And that to me is the big lesson of studying ancient climate change. Our own industrial civilization is far more vulnerable than that of the Egyptians or the ancient Mesopotamians. Millions of us live on overbuilt coastal plains or barrier islands. We're vulnerable, as Richard showed you with these pictures of Florida, to rising sea levels, not only to hurricanes and El Niño rains, but also to the melting of ice sheets. And unlike the ancestral Pueblo and the Cro-Magnons of the late Ice Age, we don't have the ability to move effortlessly from elsewhere. Like our remote ancestors, we live in an era of climatic uncertainty, accentuated by our own deeds. But we're far more vulnerable to the vicissitudes of climate change than they were, simply because we cannot move, and because our population densities and cities are so much more complex. At the same time, we have the emerging technologies to model and forecast weather. We're getting tools that enable us to plot and maybe survive the climatic changes that lie ahead. Such technologies may allow us to plan not only for ourselves, but for our grandchildren and those who will come after them. And this is an altruistic task, because the most striking thing to me about a lot of the archaeology of human society is, as I said, it's been people making decisions in good faith, and then 1,000 years later or a century later, people having to deal with the often catastrophic consequences of these decisions. We really have to think of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and this is an impossibly difficult task, probably an impossible one, because in a way we've got to change our mental gears in ways that we're not equipped to do. It's an enormous challenge. One of the most sobering experiences, I've had a lot of them lately, with writing this book, was to get a ride with a pilot on a supertanker. They're huge. They're unimaginably big. It takes 5 miles to stop one. And I thought when I was on this, and we were going into quite a wind, she wasn't moving, didn't see a thing. You could put a glass on the table and literally it would not ripple. I thought of our society in a world buffeted by climate change. In a way, we're at the helm of a vast industrial supertanker. Only a small fraction of the people on the ship with the pilot were either tinkering with the engines or doing anything relevant to its navigation. In the context of climate change, as Richard pointed out, those who control our destiny have no charts, don't really bother about the science, and don't really care about the weather forecasts. They can't even agree that they're needed. Indeed, still, some of the most powerful among us subscribe to a theory that say that storms don't exist, or if they do, the effects will be entirely benign. The steepening swells and fleeing albatrosses, the symptoms of global warming, can only be taken as a sign of divine favor. You see, the world is going to be wonderful and benign, and all humanity will live in peace. What horse manure that is! No one dares to whisper in the helmsperson's ear that he or she might consider turning the wheel before time runs out. Will technology solve the problem of human global warming? Maybe it will, and like Richard, I'm optimistic. But only if we have the vision and leadership to use it right, for the benefit, not of ourselves. As Richard said, we've seen the hors d'oeuvre, but those who are still not born. And to me as an archaeologist, the relevance of being here is not that I study garbage, which I do with great enthusiasm. The moment I'm writing a book on medieval fishing, beautifully relevant to society. But because it made me realize that very few leaders in the past have had vision. And we need vision for all the technology that we have more than anything else in the world. Thank you.